I see my role here as president of the Boston Atheists to provide a voice that is caring and non-theistic, which I think is sorely missing for a lot of people. But first I want to say thank you to Greg and Zach for setting this up and the work they've done this week. And I want to say that there are the directly affected and their immediate loved ones. And it is about them that we're here in large part. But I don't feel comfortable speaking to them, even indirectly, because their needs are too specific. Their needs are too personal and too unique. And if anyone here is connected in that way, I'm happy to talk to you one-on-one. But I'm going to address my address is to those of us who are indirectly affected, like myself, who I think I can speak to more generally with some safety. But I want to say something that will help. And I want to talk about how we are animals, that we are meaning-making animals. That we use story to understand things. And we make our stories out of the events in the same way that you make a map out of the landscape. We don't learn from the events themselves, we learn from the story we tell about the events. And something that isn't said often is that we have choice and we have agency and responsibility to tell good stories to ourselves, to use that agency and those choices to learn the right lessons. And I want to talk about a little bit about how that works. Not what story you should tell, but how you could choose and what things matter when you are choosing. When you look at your GPS to get someplace, you don't see everything about the landscape. You don't see the weather, you don't see the traffic, you don't see the parking. And in the same way, when you tell a story, you pick and choose, you highlight and background different things. And in the same way that you use a map to get somewhere, you use a story to get somewhere. You use a story to teach yourself, so that it will lead you to the future that you're headed towards. Stories have a number of parts, and I'm just going to highlight a couple. It's important to mention, to focus to some extent on the terrible events themselves, which were terrible and unspeakable. But it's also important that the bravery and compassion and heroics also happened. They are part of the story. And it's important that you remember that you can choose which ones. Great things were done. Great people came forward and did stuff that's worthy of storytelling. Another important aspect of these events is their rarity. This is not something that people talk about often in tragedy because it sounds like you're dismissing or belittling the importance of the events to those directly affected. But that's not what they do for me. Their rarity and unlikeliness diminishes their negative power. And if we're going to teach ourselves lessons, we would teach ourselves the wrong lessons if we ignored how unlikely and how rare these things are. And a story like this doesn't end at the events. Today is part of the story of this last week. Next year's marathon will be part of the story of this last week. And how we act and how we feel and what choices we make next year will be part of this last week. And it's one of the reasons that it's so important to learn the right lessons. But the part I really wanted to talk about is when you make a map, you choose which elements to include and exclude based on what's important to you. And when you tell a story of this importance, you pick which parts of the story based on what's important to you. And here we need to be vigilant because there are several things that work against us in learning good lessons. Our immediate reaction of fear is put in a pride of place by evolution. As animals who needed to survive in the wild, fear is first and foremost in a lot of ways. But that's not necessarily appropriate here and now. And so we need to guard against our own internal logic when we tell the stories. Those feelings will lead us to focus on the negative aspects, which leads us to tell a certain kind of story. The media also has these biases built in. The media is there to inform us, but it's also there to get its own ratings. And it will exploit that fear to get eyeballs. And so when you sit at home and you watch TV to find out what's going on, you'll be told a very specific story. Not the only story. Their story. And you need to be careful and mindful of what lessons you learn from them. And lastly, there are the attackers. And we don't know why they did what they did. We may never. But I think it's pretty clear that they'd be perfectly happy if we took away their lessons of hate and fear. That's what they want to teach us. That's the story they want told. But we have a choice. And I'm here to remind you of that choice and to remind you of your own capacity to choose how to tell the story. In your head, you will tell yourself what happened. And you have a choice about how that works. I choose to tell a story about bravery, about compassion, about the power of science to heal incredible things, of generosity. We don't live in a perfect world. We do not live in a world without risks. We live in a world where those risks and those imperfections bring out great things in us. And they bring out great things in the great majority of us. And that's true also. And I would remind you that that is the kind of story that you could tell to yourself. And if you find yourself in the dark of night or alone on a bus telling yourself a bad story, remember that that's not the only true story. And remember that I have told you another story. I have pointed out different things. And I may need to remind myself of this speech in those moments. Or something that somebody says to me later today. But that's what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to help you guys with something that doesn't get talked about often. You have a lot of power here. You have a lot of choice. And a lot of positive things have happened in light of all the terrible stuff.